Hey, welcome back for Weekend Jewelry School. I know it's been a little while since we've had class between Tucson and being sick and being mom and catching up. Sometimes that just happens, but we are back now and we are ready to go. So today we are talking a little bit about how to measure your metals, whether we're dealing with wire or sheet. Now, here in the United States, a lot of times the wire and the metal goes by gauges. However, when you are working with fine jewelry world or those who are international, they deal in millimeters. So sometimes it can get a little bit confusing. And there's a lot of different charts that are out there that you can look at. So a lot of books will have them in those so that you can have that as a quick reference, or some of the different online resources are available to you as well. So a lot of times if I don't have one of my quick resources with me, I'll go online and just do an inch to millimeter or millimeter to gauge type of conversion and would be able to find out that information quite easily. Well, I happen to be in the United States, so when I order my wire, I really usually only have the option to order in gauges, at least if I'm ordering from any of the big companies. Now, if you order directly from a refiner, then you possibly can order to your specification. But just keep in mind that there will probably be an additional little fee to get that. However, to get that and pay that little bit of fee may be worth it rather than taking the time and effort to draw your own wire or your metal down. But if you've got some of the tools, it's really, really simple to do. So let's take a look now at kind of what we're looking at. So here you see I've got kind of a variety of things. I have some sheet metal, I have some wire here, wire here, wire here, and then I've got a couple of different measuring items as well. And this is going to allow me to be able to see kind of what I'm dealing with. So sometimes I have a project that will call for maybe like 1.5 millimeters. So what I'm going to do is take my gauge. I want to turn this on. This just happens to be a digital caliper. I picked it up over at Harbor Freight, very inexpensive. Sometimes you have to be really careful with the more inexpensive tools because they may not be accurate, but I've had really good success with these digital calipers. And they're, like I said, they usually only run about $15 to $20, so very inexpensive. What I would do is I would take my wire and I just open up my gauge jaw here and then roll it back down. So this tells me that I'm 1.6 millimeters. I can also see what I am in inches or in a fraction as well, depending on the gauge that you have. So this is 1/16 of an inch. But that doesn't really help me because I don't know what gauge this is. I do know that I was looking for 1.5, so if I put this back over to my millimeter setting, it tells me it's 1.6, so I know that I'm larger than what I want. But what does this correspond to in the way of gauges? When you're using one of these slide calipers, the digital ones, it's not going to give you the gauges. I've not found one, but I haven't really looked really hard for one that has the gauges either. But what we do have are we have some different gauge wire gauges, and this is going to allow us to measure our wire. Now a lot of times people think, oh, it's the size of the hole and that tells you what it is, but it's not so, because see, look at this, all of these holes right here are the same size, and what you want to do is you actually want to take your wire or your sheet or whatever and you want to try to put it into the slot, and if it goes in and it's kind of snug but it fits well, then that's the gauge. In this case it tells me I'm 1.6. If I flip this over, it also tells me that I am 0.64, which also corresponds to our gauge of 14 gauge. And in this case, 1.6 millimeters. So that is how you would use these. Now, you can find these all over the place, but let me tell you right now that if you buy a cheap one that costs like $10, don't expect it to actually be accurate. I have yet to find a really inexpensive one of these tools that's accurate. In this case, I paid about $35 for this particular tool, and that's kind of what you're going to expect to pay for a decent tool that's going to be accurate. This tool actually goes from 36, 35, 34, 33, all the way up to 0 gauge. So you have a really wide range here. Like 36 millimeter, I mean, you're talking like the hair of on your head. So really, really thin there. But you do have some other options. Like I I said, this is about $35. Another really affordable one is offered through Eurotool, and this can be very good, and it's going to have your basic gauges. So we've got 34, 32, 30, all the way up to 8 gauge, and you would do the exact same thing. So we happen to know that I'm 14 gauge and it fits really well right there, not at all in the 16. It's a little too small for my 12 gauge here, so I can move this around quite easily, but in that 14 it's kind of nice and snug, and it had a similar fit on the round gauge. So this is an option that you can have as well, and I have links to these in the description for the video. Now, how do you tell on a sheet what gauge you are? So here you can see I've actually written on here what this is, so it's 18 and then I have 24 here, but how do we know that that's really truly the case? Now, in the case of my 18 gauge here, I can feel I actually have a plastic coating on this, and so I would need to remove some of this coating so that I can get an accurate measurement. Otherwise, it's going to be off because of the thickness of the coating that's on here. Now, I have marked on here that this is 18 gauge, but I'm going to start here at 16. 16, it slides in very, very easily, and there's a lot of wiggle room. 18 gauge, there it is. So it's kind of snug. Matter of fact, I'm having kind of a hard time getting it into 18 gauge. So in all reality, this could seriously be 17 gauge. So if it doesn't fit in the one that you have, you can test that and say, well, okay, it's not fitting in the 18, it's not fitting in the 16, or it's too big, 16 is too big, then you can do that it would be 17 gauge. So another thing that I can do is I can take this digital caliper and I can open this up, close it down, and this tells me that I'm 1.04. And if I look at any of my little conversion charts, I'm going to see that 18 gauge is 1.016. So if I'm 1.03 right here, that's pretty darn close, because you're talking about hundredths of a millimeter there and thousandths of a millimeter. So we're pretty good here as far as any of that goes. Now you've seen a little bit about the different wires. I've showed you how to measure those, but what do they really mean? Like the gauges, for me, when I very first got started, it was a bit confusing. So one of the things that made sense in my head, which is totally not how it works, but it made sense in my head. When you take your metal and melt it down and you pour an ingot, it becomes a rod. Well, that rod needs to somehow become this fine little wire that we're using to make our jewelry with. So what you do is, if you think about this, you have to actually pull that through a draw plate. And as you pull it through each time, that wire gets smaller and longer because you're stretching it out and you're reducing its diameter. So if you start off with that rod, let's say that that is gauge 0. Well, let's say you pull it through 5 times and now you're at 5 gauge. Again, not totally accurate, but it made sense in my head. So now let's say that we pull it through 14 times. Well, now we're down to 14 gauge. And if we pull it through 20 times, now we're down to 20 gauge. So the more often we pull it down, the thinner that wire gets and the longer it's getting as well. But we're talking about that diameter now. And we want to keep in mind that the larger the number, the smaller or thinner that wire is that we are working with. So if I pull it through 24 times, now we're at 24 gauge. Now again, like I said, totally not accurate as far as how many times you pull it through to get to that gauge, but it's something that made sense in my head, that the larger the number means it's been pulled through more times. So therefore my wire is getting smaller. The larger that number, the smaller my wire. The smaller my number, the larger my wire, because it's not been pulled through as many times. So like I said, not accurate, but it makes sense, and hopefully that'll kind of help you keep it straight as you're starting to learn this. And really, when it comes down to it, the best way to learn is to figure out what the size of your wire actually is and do that in your millimeters, because that is the unit that the jewelry world works with. So now I've showed you a couple of different ways to measure your metal, but what do you do with it if you need it to be slightly smaller? And maybe that slightly smaller gauge is not available, or you don't have time to wait for that. Well, there are definitely tools that are out there. Now, this being the weekend jewelry school, this is kind of geared towards people who are brand new to doing jewelry. They may not have all the tools. So at that point, you're just kind of going to be limited to what you can buy as far as ready-made materials. However, once you get into this a little bit more, then you can start to buy other tools that will allow you to change the size and the shape of your material. So one thing that I can do with sheet, for instance, is I can roll this down in a rolling mill. And a lot of times it's very easy to reduce this to whatever gauge or whatever millimeter size that I want to use. Now let's say you don't have a rolling mill, because I highly doubt that some of our ancient forefathers in jewelry making had rolling mills either. So what did they have? They had hammers. So you could easily hammer this metal down to stretch it out and thin it down. Now keep in mind that when you do that, you are hardening the material, and that's going to bring up some new obstacles, but that is an entirely different video that we will get to later. So you do have a couple of options: rolling it down, ordering it the right size, or even hammering it. So that's how you're going to take care of your sheet. But how do you take care of your wire? How do you handle that? So these here are draw plates. This is a brand new one that I just got, so I haven't even opened it yet. It's still in the plastic. These are draw plates, and what you do is you can actually take your wire and draw it down to different sizes. And I think you guys can kind of see some of those little holes in there, and it goes from larger down to really small. In this case, I start off with 2.2 millimeters, which is approximately about, I don't know, about 11.5-ish gauge. 11, 12 gauge is kind of what 2.2 millimeters is. And then you would take it and you would draw it down through this and you pull it through. Now again, using a draw plate is a different video. However, I do have videos on that, including the video of how to create your own draw bench to be able to use these. Now in the case of your draw plates, you definitely get what you pay for. So let me just put that out there right now, and I will have another video shortly that shows the difference between the economy tools that are only like $25 per plate versus the nice tools, which run about $120 per plate. But there is a big difference, and it is something that if you are going to be drawing down your own wire, skip the economy version and save up your pennies and do it right the first time. Otherwise, you're just going to be frustrated because you don't get great results and you're going to end up spending your money again. So sometimes it pays to do the right tool. When you order wire, what is it that we're looking for? How does it come? So let's take a look at that now. I can get my wire from a number of different places. This wire here came from my local hardware store. It tells me that it's 0.81 millimeters, and if I were to look that up on one of my charts, it tells me it's 20 gauge, but it also says it's 20 gauge here. However, I find that sometimes these are off just a little bit. So it told me that it was 0.8 millimeters. However, when I measure this, it's really only 0.75. So that's going to put me down closer to 21 gauge, kind of in between 21 and 20. So keep in mind that's not always going to be exact. Now, I order some wire from different suppliers, whether it's Monster Slayer, Rio, Contenti, wherever it is that you get your wire and stuff. And again, I'm going to measure this to see how it converts to what my chart would be. So this is supposed to be 16 gauge, which should be 1.29 millimeters, and we are right there about 1.8, 1.29, or 1.28, 1.29. So that one's pretty on as far as my 16 gauge. So you can buy these in 1 pound spools, half pound, quarter pound spools. It just depends on where you're looking to order your wire from. Same type of thing here. So this one is a quarter pound or a 4 ounce little spool, and so it'll come like that. Now another thing that you can do is you can get stuff from the craft store. So this is just a normal craft wire. Again, it tells me it's 16 gauge, so if I check this, we should be around 1.3, and it is. But you might want to be aware that when you do these coated ones, that coating can sometimes change your measurement as well. Now there'll be times when I order by the ounce, and sometimes, especially if I'm ordering a really fine wire, like in the case of this one happens to be fine silver, and it is also 28 gauge, which is really thin. So again, if I check 28 gauge, it should be 0.3 millimeters, and we are spot on at 0.3 millimeter for that one. Now, this is a really fine one, and so whenever you have super fine metals like this, a lot of times they will come on a spool, like a plastic spool like this. Now here it says 2.04 ounces, but when I ordered 4 ounces. What they've done on here is marked the weight of the spool before they actually did the wire onto it, and then if this were to be accurate and I ordered 4 ounces, then I should have 6.04 ounces total with the spool itself. So that's how you're going to look at something like that. A lot of times they will mark your wire with some kind of a tag or a sticker, so that you can kind of keep that. Now, how do you keep your wire? Now, let me show you this. This is an order that I just barely got in. So this is something that I just received. And again, if I open this up and look, so there's multiple pieces that are in one bag. So if I pull everything out, we have my spool. All right, so we have our spool, and again, we've got 1.8 troy ounces. That tells me the weight of my spool, but I've got 3 ounces of silver on this. Then there's also other wires and gauges that I purchased as well, different shapes. There's a half round, another half round, a triangle, a very large round like a 4 gauge or something like that. So notice that they're all in bags, they're all labeled, they tell me what my ounces are, and that's a great thing because then I can easily see how much I've used at the end of the day when I come back and I can just weigh this. Now the bags, I also keep them in the bags. Why do I do that? Well, it keeps my tarnish down. So if you don't want to be cleaning your silver all the time, keep them in the bags and then organize them. How do I organize mine? I use file folders. So I just have a little hanging file folder system, and each of the file folders are labeled with whatever their gauge is. Now at this point, as I move more in my career to doing more fine jewelry and whatever else, I'm starting to get used to the millimeter sizes. So instead of having it just labeled 18 gauge, I will also label it with its millimeter size. And that's going to help me to recognize what gauge is what millimeter. Because when it comes to your gauges, it's a name. You cannot add it. You can't add 14 gauge plus 16 gauge and actually come out with a name or a number because it's a name. Like I might as well have called my wire George or Harry or Sam. So you want to be able to calculate something, and in order to calculate something, you have to have a real number, and that real number would be your millimeters. So it would be a very good idea to get used to the millimeter sizes. To make things a little bit easier for you, I've also included a simple conversion chart down in the description of the video. It's going to give you basically the inch, the millimeter, and then the gauge sizes that all correspond with each other, starting from I think about like 36 gauge all the way up to gauge 0. So it's something that you can just kind of copy and paste and use that as a quick reference. So hopefully this helps you understand how to measure and figure out what gauge or size of wire or sheet you're using. If you don't already, I would highly suggest that you invest in either a sheet metal gauge, that round or that rectangle one, or you definitely get a caliper, or really both, because they are definitely going to come in handy as you begin to work more and more with your different wires and your sheets and the sizes, and especially if you start to get into any of the more advanced things, kind of like what we're doing with Tool Time Tuesday and working through the Alan Revere series of videos and projects, because in those books, they are going to use the millimeters and the actual sizes, not gauges. So it is definitely important that it's something that you kind of get used to and make yourself familiar with. Thank you guys so much for joining me here in class today, and I will see you guys at the next session. Have a good day.